Okay, so picture this. It's London, 1888. Yeah. Thick, foggy streets, gaslight flickering on cobblestones. But we're not in the fancy parts of town, oh no. We're going deep into Whitechapel.
Now, Whitechapel, that was where the less fortunate lived. Poverty, and the kind of grim realities that most folks didn't want to talk about.
And looming over it all, this name that still chills us to the bone. Jack the Ripper.
Even today, over a century later, that name it gets under your skin.
So in this deep dive, we're not just rehashing the gory details. We're going to dig into what makes this case haunt us. Why Jack the Ripper out of all the criminals in history?
Right, because it wasn't just the murders themselves, gruesome as they were. It's how this case gripped the city, the way it exposed just how unprepared, how behind the times the police were back then.
They had no clue, basically.
Basically, no DNA evidence, no fancy profiling like we have now. They were relying on eyewitness accounts, and in that fog at night, good luck with that.
Talk about a needle in a haystack. But to really grasp why this case still matters, we got to start with the victims. Yeah. History remembers them as the canonical five, and trust me, their stories are essential.
Yeah, these weren't just names in a police report. These were women, each with their own lives, their own struggles. And their stories, tragic as they are key to understanding the Ripper's reign of terror.
So we start with Mary Ann Nichols, found August 31st, 1888. Throat slashed. Horrible wounds to her abdomen. Just awful.
And it's that detail, the abdominal mutilations, that really begins to set this case apart, right? It goes beyond just a simple murder. It speaks to a deeper level of rage, maybe even a twisted sense of purpose.
Chilling, really. But it gets worse. Just over a week later, September 8th, they find Annie Chapman. Same MO, left out in the open.
Yeah.
It's like he wanted to send a message.
Oh, he definitely wanted to be heard, to instill fear. And what's scarier than killing once? Killing again, proving that the first time wasn't a fluke. This was a pattern. This was someone hunting.
And then, September 30th, things get really intense. 2 women, same night. Elizabeth Stride first. Now, her throat was cut, yeah, but no major mutilations like the others. This has fueled debate for, over 100 years?
Oh, huge debate. Was this even the Ripper, or did the panic, the copycats, start coming out of the woodwork? That uncertainty, it's part of what keeps this whole thing so fascinating.
Because if it wasn't him, that means someone else was out there doing similarly awful things.
Right. Imagine the terror in Whitechapel, knowing one killer or 2 were on the loose. But that same night, they find Catherine Eddowes, and this murder, it's got the Ripper signature all over it. The mutilations, the brutality, it reinforced that fear that there was someone stalking these women, specifically.
It's like something out of a nightmare. But it's all too real. Weeks go by after Catherine Eddowes. Longest gap yet. People probably hoping it was over.
You can almost feel the city trying to breathe again, thinking maybe he's gone. But that hope, it was tragically misguided.
Because then, November 9th, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly. And this was different, even more brutal. They could barely identify her. The crescendo of this whole awful symphony of violence. 5 women connected by this fog of fear and the savagery inflicted upon them.
And you got to remember, this is 1888. No electric lights everywhere, just those gas lights casting shadows that could hide anything. Imagine yourself walking those streets back then, knowing what we know now. Every corner is a potential crime scene. And as if the murders themselves weren't enough to grip the city in fear, the killer decided to make himself known directly. Not just by leaving his gruesome handiwork, but by speaking in a way.
Right. That's when that infamous letter shows up, the one they call the Dear Boss letter. No, this wasn't just a note left at the scene or anything. This landed right on the police's doorstep. And it wasn't signed Sincerely Yours, let me tell you.
Oh, no, this was signed Jack the Ripper, a name that sends chills down your spine, even now, right?
Yeah.
But back then, nobody had ever heard it before.
Talk about a way to introduce yourself to the world, right?
Right.
And it wasn't just the name that got under people's skin. He wrote about these women, the ones he was targeting, in such a cold, almost righteous way.
Like he was justifying it in a way.
Oh.
And that line, I'm sure you remember it, where he says, "I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them until I do get buckled." Chilling, isn't it?
It's like he's daring the police to stop him. But it makes you wonder, was it actually him who wrote it? Or was it someone messing with everyone, trying to capitalize on the panic?
130 years later, we still don't know for sure. And that's the thing about forensic science back then. They didn't have the tools to just analyze the ink, the paper, the handwriting, like we do now. So there's this nagging doubt that maybe, just maybe, Dear Boss, and those other letters were just elaborate hoaxes.
Imagine being a detective back then, trying to sort through all these clues, these whispers, and not even knowing if the killer's words were actually his. Talk about a headache. So how do you even begin to narrow down the suspects when you've got that much uncertainty?
It's like trying to find a single grain of sand on a beach, right? Every grain looks the same. But the police, they had their theories. There was Montague John Druitt, this well-educated barrister who took his own life not long after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. Was it guilt? Or was he just a desperate man caught in the crosshairs?
And then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel, struggling with mental illness. He was a suspect for a long time.
But was that because they genuinely suspected him? Or because he was an easy target in a climate of fear and suspicion towards immigrants? It makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. And then you've got the rumors that pointed fingers all the way to the top, to royalty. Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria herself, even got dragged into it.
That's what's so fascinating about this case, even now. It's like a historical Rorschach test. Everyone sees something different in the fog and shadows of Whitechapel.
And without that one solid answer, that smoking gun, those shadows just keep getting longer. The mystery just gets more intriguing over time. It's wild, isn't it? We've got this fog-choked city, terrified, and a killer who vanishes like smoke. But here's the thing that really gets me. It's been, what, almost 150 years? And we are still talking about Jack the Ripper. Why?
It's more than just a cold case, isn't it? Jack the Ripper, he's become this cultural icon almost. Something about this story, it dug its claws into our collective imagination and never let go.
Because it's easy to get stuck on the gore, the mystery. But you're right, there's something deeper going on. It's like he reflects something about us, about the dark side we try not to think about.
Exactly. This wasn't just happening in a vacuum. Victorian London, it was a time of massive change. Poverty, the role of women, people scared of immigrants. Jack became a symbol of all that unease, lurking in the shadows of a society on the edge.
Right. It's like he gave a face, or a name at least, to those fears that were already simmering beneath the surface.
And let's be honest, unsolved mysteries. They're like a siren song for the human mind. We can't resist them. Because we don't know for sure who Jack was, our imaginations run wild trying to fill in the blanks. He becomes a blank slate onto which we project our own theories, our darkest fears, you know?
Which explains why there's a whole industry built around him. Books, documentaries, movies. Everyone has their own take on Jack the Ripper.
Because we're all dying to be the one to finally crack the code, right? Even if it's impossible, that lack of closure just makes it more alluring. It makes you wonder, what would we do differently today? With DNA, CCTV cameras everywhere. Could someone like Jack even exist in our world, or would we catch him right away?
Man, that's a chilling thought. To think that kind of darkness could still be out there, hiding in plain sight.
Makes you appreciate how far we've come, but also reminds us that some things never really change, do they? Human nature, the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface. It's a sobering thought.
It is. Well, that's Jack the Ripper for you. A mystery wrapped in a riddle, shrouded in London fog. And we want to know what you think. Who was Jack? Could he have gotten away with it today? Hit us up on our socials. Let's keep this conversation going.